The time is 10 a.m. A young man is folded on the floor of a dark cell. A gentle tap wakes him up from his sleep. The governor tells him that his execution time has been set for 10 a.m. that very morning. He immediately sat up in disbelief. He expected that death would come in weeks due to the usual formalities that come with being a prisoner of war. He wanted to argue, but his lips wouldn't form any words. All he could mutter was, "It's very hard to bear. It's so sudden." When you are sentenced to death, there is no hope. Death is certain and has a specific appointment. If you were to get chased, you would at least be concerned with escaping before your demise and that life would still be possible. You would not have the time to consider the finality of your life. But when you have been told what time you will go, it is very difficult to process. As he was brought out to the execution grounds, he left a choking in his throat. His mind wanted to fight, but his body was powerless and unable to move. A priest presented him with a silver cross. He kissed it greedily and thought of his brother at the last minute, realizing how much he loved and missed him. He and his fellow prisoners, including a close friend, were tied to pillars. Bags were put over their heads. It was almost time. But then, just before shots were fired, he was released, along with the rest of the group. His Imperial Majesty has granted us our lives. The Russian author Fyodor Dostoevsky survived his near-death experience. The whole ordeal was staged, intended to be the first step of his punishment, psychological torture. One of the prisoners who stood with him was completely broken from this event and driven to insanity. But Dostoevsky triumphed over death and was inspired to embrace life in a way that he had never done before. However, that would only be the beginning of the many fights Dostoevsky would have with death, both physically and mentally. My life begins again today. I will receive 4 years hard labor, and after that will serve as a private. I see that life is everywhere, life in ourselves. There will be people near me, and to be among them, that is the purpose of life, I have realized. Before his fake execution, he saw life quite differently. Dostoevsky spent much of his childhood in the residence of Moscow's Mariinsky Hospital for the Poor. His father was a physician, which meant that Fyodor witnessed the struggles of the sick and the impoverished up close. He was also introduced to literature at a young age. Although he would become a lieutenant engineer, he was distracted by literary opportunities. After translating several texts with little financial success, in 1845 he published his first novel, Poor Folk. It was an immediate success, and he quickly explored literary circles, where he started to embrace the values of utopian socialism. He would meet with socialist groups and discuss reforms such as abolishing serfdom and establishing freedom of press. By this point, both of his parents had died, and his health was compromised by epilepsy. He was prone to seizures that he believed were triggered by losing sleep, drinking too much, and overworking. Before the seizures, Dostoevsky describes feelings of déjà vu and, following them, overwhelming fatigue. They had a lasting impact on his health and instilled a sense of fear that the seizures could happen at any time. Life was already a struggle, but everything took a sharp turn for the worse. His regular meetings with socialist groups caught the attention of the Russian Empire. Tsar Nicholas I was worried about a revolution and determined that critics of the government were dangerous. They needed to be detained, and that meant that vocal critics such as the socialist groups were at great risk. Dostoevsky's involvement in the Petrushevsky circle is what ultimately led to his arrest. He was accused of being critical of the armed forces and creating anti-Russian government propaganda on an illegal printing press. After his mock execution in 1849, he was sentenced to 4 years of hard labor in Siberia, which was brutal and degrading. Guards took joy in humiliating prisoners and dehumanizing them. Dostoevsky describes this horrible treatment in his 1862 novel, The House of the Dead. He uses the character Goryanchikov as a vehicle to convey his own experience in the Siberian prison camp. In the story, the protagonist has killed his wife and turned himself in. From there, the first-person diary describes the true horrors of the camp. During his confinement, Goryanchikov was never alone. Prisoners had no privacy at any time and were in close quarters, always sharing rooms and always being visible. They were confined to filthy conditions, forced to live in squalor, and in close proximity to antisocial individuals. The camp was a form of hell where suffering was present everywhere. Each prisoner was forced to share a room with a rotating number of inmates. Many would make Goryanchikov feel unsafe as he tried to rest. Sleep under these conditions was almost impossible. What the prisoners of the camp lacked most of all was human dignity. It was denied to them thoroughly by the conditions, the proximity to other inmates, and the cruelty of the guards. At the camp, the prisoners were forced to do manual labor. They had to make bricks and dig up earth. And although the actual work was not tiring, there was something truly awful about it. There was a purpose to the work, but that purpose was not relevant to the prisoners. As Goryanchikov explains, "It once came into my head that if I were desired to reduce a man to nothing, to punish him atrociously, to crush him in such a manner that the most hardened murderer would tremble before such a punishment and take fright beforehand, it would be necessary to give his work a character of complete uselessness, even to absurdity. A farmer may work harder and longer hours than the prisoner, but they are working to suit their own ends. Their labor produces fruit that the convict could never hope to enjoy." The other inmates in the House of the Dead cause the narrator great misery, but also become a source of value. Goryanchikov develops relationships with them. They form bonds, share stories, and humanize each other. Goryanchikov also recounts how the characters manage to find freedom in the camp. They smuggle alcohol to trade for currency, which they are able to use as they please. This gives some of the prisoners a sense of agency that the camp has largely robbed them of. The prison does not reform the inmates, but through denying human dignity, makes them monsters. Systematically, it perpetuates a cycle of violence. Corporal punishment is inflicted on them, and it shapes who they become. It does not impact their moral guidance. In Dostoevsky's real-life experience of a Siberian camp, many of his fellow prisoners died in the brutal conditions. Yet again, Dostoevsky would simply not let death win. Instead, like his traumatic episode with the faked firing squad, his time in the camp shaped his view of life in a tremendous way that he would explore more in his other novels. Human life deserves dignity and freedom. That's what was taken away from Dostoevsky when he was first apprehended and what he eventually got back. The author insists that our need for freedom is what makes us human. After his time at the camp, he was forced into military service in the Siberian Army Corps for a few years. To start publishing again, he had to send a formal letter of apology to the government. In 1857, he married a widow named Maria Isayeva. On their honeymoon, she witnessed one of his seizures, complicating their marriage from that point onward. His health struggles and their unique personalities put pressure on their union until she died just 7 years later. During his time in prison, Dostoevsky developed a distaste for the ideology he once embraced, which became a big theme in his work. 2 years after publishing The House of the Dead, Dostoevsky released Notes from the Underground, in which he expressed his rejection of the way the socialist radicals of his time viewed humanity in a mechanistic way. In his novel, he highlights a Russian society that is increasingly using science to understand human beings. Humanity is treated as an entity determined by casual laws. The liberals of the time suggested that we can understand human behavior psychologically and human history in a strictly casual manner. The unnamed narrator in the book is critical of the idea that a utopian society can be built based on strictly casual understandings of human beings. Even if it could, he believes people would hate being treated this way. The narrator explains his position. If you say that this too can be calculated and tabulated, chaos and darkness and curses, so that the mere possibility of calculating it all beforehand would stop it all, and reason would reassert itself, then man would purposely go mad in order to be rid of reason and gain his point. This utopian society would undermine the one value that gives life its meaning, our capacity to choose and build our own lives. In their vision for the future, he saw reflections of the prison camp that robbed him of his agency and his dignity. In the second half of the book, the narrator reflects on his past behavior, acting out against his casual understanding of the human being. Out of spite, he starts acting against his best interests. He behaves like a complete fool at a party. When his tooth aches, he refuses to go to the dentist. When the man is shown warmth, he rejects it. Eventually, he causes his own destruction, demonstrating that his rejection of casuality and systemization isn't any better than the utopian version of society. Dostoevsky inspired many other works of fiction, including the 1924 dystopian book We by Yevgeny Zamyatin. In the novel, the author portrays the world as a futuristic version of the socialist utopia. As in most dystopias, the main character, D503, feels that something is wrong with his society. He wants to make choices for himself, including who he loves and what he learns. Eventually, D503 tries to break free of the society that satiates and controls him. The book is meant to reflect our human need to be treated as ambiguous while predicting the terrors of the Soviet Union. It is a precursor to other dystopian classics such as 1984 and Brave New World. In Notes from the Underground, Dostoevsky demonstrates the human need for freedom of choice while also showing how a reckless pursuit of it can cause great harm. We have to be thoughtful in how we react to ideology. It is not enough to just mirror their position. In The Possessed, one of his follow-up novels, Dostoevsky directly attacks utopian socialism and the notion of enforced equality. Through his characters, he expresses his concern that such a utopia requires suppression of all independent thought and individuality. Here's an excerpt from one of the critics in the novel. "But what are the men I've broken with? The enemies of all true life. Out-of-date liberals who are afraid of their own independence. The flunkies of thought. The enemies of individuality and freedom. The decrepit advocates of deadness and rottenness. All they have to offer is senility and glorious mediocrity of the most bourgeois kind. Contemptible shallowness, a jealous equality, equality without individual dignity." The book portrays intellectuals as ruthless and uncaring of how their designs would impact the people they supposedly speak on behalf of. Dostoevsky clearly sides and sympathizes with the ordinary people in society over calculating intellectuals. After his time in prison, he had an admiration for persons who didn't try to impose their theories on others. In his most well-known book, 1866's Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky challenges his ideological approach to life specifically. He gives a close-up view of his attitude and action in all its grotesqueness. The book focuses on Raskolnikov, a former student who struggles with financial problems. He's also a theorist who publishes work on the subject of extraordinary people. In his theory, Raskolnikov suggests that it's okay for great people like Napoleon and Caesar to commit immoral acts. He divides people into two categories: extraordinary people and people who just exist to procreate. He contends that we should allow great people to transgress to make progress possible. Raskolnikov goes on to question morality in general. What if man is not really a scoundrel? Man in general, I mean, the whole race of mankind. Then all of the rest is prejudice, simply artificial terrors, and there are no barriers and it's all as it should be. Raskolnikov's view aligns somewhat with Friedrich Nietzsche's concept of higher and lower types. Nietzsche believed that the norms of morality shouldn't apply to everyone, and that they would limit higher types in their pursuit of excellence. Dostoevsky was not aware of Nietzsche's work, however. In Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov decides to solve his financial problems by putting his theory to the test. He murders an old pawnbroker woman in cold blood, and then an innocent bystander who witnesses the immediate aftermath. In his mind, he believes that great people such as himself should be allowed to kill, but also that the pawnbroker woman deserved it for oppressing the poor. He has a mess of justifications in his mind. The act is brutal in depiction and feels incredibly unnatural. Few other stories demonstrate murder outside of necessity or psychopathy. A killing committed with only loose theoretical justification is extraordinarily awkward and grotesque. In the aftermath, guilt tears Raskolnikov apart. He feels a horrible sense of isolation from others, laying sickly in bed, avoiding life in any capacity. Our protagonist is a complete mess. He tries to understand exactly why he committed the murders, but he can never come to a definitive conclusion. As he wallows in misery, Detective Porfiry Petrovich picks up on his guilt, but has no concrete evidence. Petrovich toys with Raskolnikov until he offers him a more lenient sentence in return for a confession. In the end, it is a Christian sex worker, Sonia, who convinces Raskolnikov to confess. He He mostly confesses out of emotional stress, but later repents with Sonia's guidance. Raskolnikov is sentenced to a Siberian prison camp where Sonia follows. Raskolnikov dehumanizes his primary victim using theory. He forces an ideology on her with horrific consequences. The world around the main character is also engaging in a similar process. Russian society is going through a major reform that results in an intense period of poverty and crime. Serfdom was abolished in 1861, but the serfs themselves were worse off because of how emancipation unfolded. Landowners kept most of their land, and the serfs had to compensate them for the rest. Since they had no money, they had to borrow it from the state and landowners. However, the land the serfs received was largely small and in poor quality. They struggled to pay the taxman, and many were swallowed by debt. In his novel, Dostoevsky details the widespread poverty and crime that results from the emancipation. This serves as a reminder of how reforms can leave people behind, even if they're intended to help humanity. Ideologues rarely account for the important details such as human dignity and welfare. The author himself struggled financially for most of his writing career. He needed his books to succeed to pay off his debts. Losing most of his finances gambling, Dostoevsky wrote The Gambler and Crime and Punishment under intense deadlines. He had to hire a stenographer just to finish them, who he married shortly after. He also continued to struggle with epilepsy. His seizures left him in poor health for extended periods of time. He had to fit in his writing between bouts of exhaustion, which put further financial strain on him and his new family. He put a lot of his life and perspective into his work, from his epilepsy to his Christianity. In 1869's The Idiot, he writes about a fictional prince who suffers from seizures and represents a Christ-like figure. Prince Myshkin is gentle, kind, and very generous. He tries to be as selfless as possible in his interactions and timidly resists his desires for pleasure. The prince also finds beauty in life regardless of his circumstances. I used to watch The Line Where Earth and Sky Met, and longed to go and seek there the key of all mysteries, thinking that I might find there a new life, perhaps some great city where life should be grander and richer, and then it struck me that life may be grand enough even in a prison. Myshkin is released from a mental institution and becomes entangled with two distinct groups. One consists of rich, worldly people who are powerful and conservative. The other consists of young, rebellious youth who are very intellectual but foolish at the same time. For his Christ-like behavior, both groups despise Myshkin for stepping on their toes. Later in the story, the prince has the option of choosing between two women to marry. In his mind, he would choose Nastasia out of compassion and Aglaya out of desire. He tries to pick Nastasia selflessly, but on their wedding day, she leaves him. She finds Prince Myshkin to be too pure. Nastasia instead runs to Rogozhin, a man who is very jealous of the prince's engagement to Nastasia. Rogozhin kills her, and the prince goes mad while trying to console Rogozhin in his anguish. In The Idiot, Dostoevsky tries to demonstrate how a Christ-like figure would fit into 1860s Russian society, and as you can tell, it didn't go very well. Everyone around the prince hates him and ends up worse off in general. Dostoevsky rejects the values of materialism embodied by the conservative elite and young rebels. He shows us that the Russian society at the time would revile Christ in the flesh, even if most would still claim to believe in Christianity. In his opinion, Russian society needed to completely rethink its religious values. The Brothers Karamazov was Dostoevsky's last book, published in 1880. He wrote it 3 months before he died of 3 pulmonary hemorrhages. These were a result of several seizures happening in quick succession. While Dostoevsky was a Christian, he was also a skeptic. He constantly challenged his beliefs in Christianity, even if he always remained a believer. In a well-known letter, he writes, "If someone proved to me that Christ is outside of the truth, and that in reality truth were outside of Christ, then I should remain with Christ rather than with the truth." With the Brothers Karamazov, he uses an intellectual character, Ivan, to give a blistering challenge against God. In the chapter The Grand Inquisitor, Ivan writes a story about Christ returning to his world during the Spanish Inquisition, a period in history where the monarchy in Spain forced Jews to be baptized or face death. Many were killed, and the ones who converted under pressure were always confronted with suspicion. When Christ arrives, the Inquisitor immediately arrests him as a heretic of the church. He yells at Christ for offering the people freedom when what they really want is security. They want to be certain that they have no possibility of committing error and sin. As the Inquisitor explains, there are three powers alone, able to conquer and to hold captive forever the conscience of these impotent rebels for their happiness. Those forces are miracle, mystery, and authority. The church has essentially adapted to the weakness of humanity with control. In this chapter, Dostoevsky criticizes both the Catholic Church and the socialists of his time. Both seek to impose authority on people who are supposedly too weak to know what is best for them. He wants to return to a more pure version of Christianity that respects the freedom of the individual, their moral responsibility, and their dignity. Dostoevsky had a strong fondness for Russian Orthodoxy, which he believed was the religion of the common people. The church in Spain wanted to create a Christian kingdom here on earth, but Christ rejected the enforcement of belief as documented in the biblical narrative referred to as the temptation of Christ. He wanted people to believe in him through free will and faith. Jesus is silent as the Inquisitor yells at him. Interpretations vary, but it's possible that Christ is trying not to interfere with humanity's free will in the story. He is showing by example, not telling. The chapter ends with Christ kissing the Inquisitor on the lips. The Inquisitor releases him, but tells him to never return again. When people suffer traumatic incidences, they often respond by trying to control their surroundings. From experiencing an overwhelming sense of powerlessness, they grow to want people and situations to be predictable. They are adverse to risk and demand perfection. For hours, Dostoevsky thought he was going to be put to death. It was an incredible moment of powerlessness. He had to confront the certainty of his life ending at a set time. As he described in letters and books, this punishment is even more cruel than the crime of murder, as the victim of murder isn't certain they will die. But his imprisonment wasn't justified on any moral grounds. He was apprehended for independent thought because the prospect of revolution threatened the Russian Tsar. He had to stomach a sentencing that he could not rationalize himself. Although his life was returned to him, he still had to give up control over his destiny to the state for several years. In grueling conditions, he worked toward an end that was not his own and suffered constant abuse from guards and inmates. The author lost 2 children at young ages. His first wife and brother died months apart. Both were dear to him and, at the time, were his only strong connections in the world. He writes about his loss in a letter to his friend, Baron Wrangel. And thus, I suddenly found myself alone and simply terrified. My entire life at one stroke broke into 2. In one half, which I had lived through, was everything I had lived for, and in the other, still unknown half, everything was strange and new, and there was not a single heart that could replace those 2. Literally, I had nothing left for which to live. So much of his life was beyond his control, and yet Dostoevsky didn't abandon life for security. He came to value it more and encouraged others to do the same in his body of work. He believed in the valuing of human dignity, freedom, and moral responsibility. This is how he fought death and won, by embracing what he determined to be fundamental demands of human life, found in your common man, beyond intellectual scheming. However, Dostoevsky was writing in a specific place in time. What he considered to be enemies of human dignity have changed and grown in many cases. Utopian socialism would eventually be channeled into Leninism. Much of what he expressed in The Possessed came to fruition in the Soviet Union. Our materialist preoccupations have grown exponentially as capitalism has become the dominant ideology worldwide. Worker exploitation is slowly eroding our freedom to choose a life for ourselves and maintain human dignity. Every day, more of the fruits of our labor goes to the leadership class while we're expected to work longer hours. Like in the Siberian prison camp, many are borderline stuck in their low-paying positions, especially with the cost of living being so high. The Church in the United States is trying to create a Christian kingdom once more, despite the teachings of Christ in the Bible. We don't have to agree with Dostoevsky's Christian worldview to appreciate his project and his personal story. We can certainly question the role of moral responsibility in society and the notion of a Christian God. The author himself always checked his belief with a healthy amount of skepticism, after all. But the notion of cherishing life after nearly losing it is something valuable we should all remind ourselves of. If you find yourself diminishing human life in favor of ideology or principles, remind yourself that there's nothing more important in this world than the living. There will be people near me, and to be among people. That is the purpose of life, I have realized.